Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm very excited for because it's quite literally a year in the making. That's right friends, today I'm going to be chatting through my favorite books I read in 2023. Now for the year of 2023, I did read just over 90 books, which I am personally pretty pleased with. Now there were some books I definitely did not like at all, which I did make an entirely separate video on. The books that I did read this year that I loved was actually quite plentiful, so narrowing this list down was super hard. With that in mind, I do have a top 10 to go through today, but for probably the first time in a long time, I do have some honorable mentions that I just could not leave out of this video and had to include. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the books. Starting off with my honorable mentions, I'm just going to quickly mention these to try to keep this video from not going too out of control with length, but I did love these books so much and highly recommend them. The first is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. I read both books out in this series and adored both of them. This is a very cozy, very heartwarming, very endearing short story collection by this author. It's basically set in a near futuristic society where capitalism has ended and humanity has sort of progressed in an entirely different direction. We follow our main character as they venture out into the wilderness, trying to find personal direction for their life, and they stumble across our other main character who is a robot. They form an unlikely friendship and companionship begins to bloom from there. It's funny and endearing and lovely. Both of these books made me laugh and cry, and they definitely warmed my heart. Next, I have Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. This is one of the first books I read in 2023, and I never stopped thinking about it. I did not read as much literary fiction as I wanted to this year, but this lit fic book definitely stood the test of time for a personal favorite of mine. It was excellent. In this speculative fiction novel, the author explores emigration and the refugee crisis around the world, and we're following two main characters as they're forced to flee their country and emigrate west, and how their lives and relationship change due to this event. The writing style of this is stunning and honestly haunting and incredibly imaginative and will completely immerse you within this story and experience. It's a short book, but I feel like it leaves a huge impact while reading it. Again, a 5 out of 5 star read for me and one of my favorites for the year. Next, I have The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. This was actually my first Mark Lawrence read, and I was really endeared with how much I liked this book. This is a story that centers an endless magical library, and if I'm being honest, that sort of setting in a fantasy story is one that's always going to call out to me, but I do feel like Mark Lawrence captured the immensity of his setting so well. And in this very magical and mysterious story, we're following two main characters that come from two very different places and watch as their lives and fate slowly become intertwined with one another. A large part of the experience of reading this book is unpacking what is going on. There's a central murky mystery at the heart of it, and I really love discovering and unpacking that mystery, and the vibes of this book were just honestly very strong. If you love books about books or like magical libraries, this is a great one to check out. And the last honorable mention title I have to show off is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Madana. This is a cozy, contemporary, heartwarming read, and I fell in love. I laughed, I cried, I was so endeared to all of the characters and just the entire experience of this. I had a smile across my face the entire time. This is a story where we follow our main character who is a witch, and she has been told her entire life to hide this fact, making it difficult for her to sort of find connections both in friendship and romantically. At the beginning of this book, she's propositioned in a very interesting way to basically become a teacher for 3 young witches at a faraway estate. She decides to do it, and her life is changed forever, full of found family, romance, second chances, and magic. I loved this book. I also listened to the audiobook. It was truly adorable, worth all the hype, and definitely one of my best cozy pickups for 2023. Alrighty, the honorable mentions are now over and we're officially moving into my official top 10. Do keep in mind these books are in no particular order. It was already hard enough for me to narrow it down to this list, so clearly I love and recommend all of these books for different reasons, but let's just go ahead and dive in. The first book in series I have to mention is the Fitz and the Fool series by Robin Hobb. I think I've had a Robin Hobb book or series grace my top 10 now for many, many years, but I am finally on the final trilogy within the Robin Hobb universe or the realm of the Elderlings, and I'm really sad that it's finally coming to an end, but I'm also happy to report that this final series has been so unbelievably excellent, but also incredibly heartbreaking. And I am currently emotionally unwell just thinking and talking about this series. But if you're not familiar, The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb is a series comprised of many different series. The first set of series are following one of our central main characters, Fitz, and we have other series that are more multi-POV following a much larger cast of characters and kind of a larger geographical footprint as well. But with this final installment, we are back in Fitz's world, back in Fitz's head, and I am not okay. We have gone on such an immense journey with this main character. We have followed him from a young boy growing into a young man, into adulthood, and now into a later stage in his life. And I just feel like the pacing of this final trilogy has been incredible. The slow, methodical, home-oriented nature of the story was perfectly crafted to also rip your heart out and just feed it back to you by the time you get to the end of book 1 and into book 2. I loved the new characters introduced within this trilogy, and obviously I love revisiting Fitz and the Fool's relationship, which is one of the most interesting and dynamic in all of fantasy. Books 1 and 2 were amazing. I did not get to book 3 in 2023, but I will be finishing it in 2024, and there's a high chance that book will be on a favorites list in the future, but I have to include Robin Hobb, of course. Here we are. Next is a new book to a new fantasy series that I feel like is going to be taking the world by storm. I felt as a first installment to a new fantasy world, I was hooked, and I can't wait to see where the series is going to take us next. And that book is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is a Roman-inspired fantasy story. It also has a military school setting, espionage, and honestly so much action and character connections, it becomes impossible to put down. In this story, we're introduced to our main character, Viz, and he lives in a fantasy world very much inspired by the Roman Empire. There's a very strong hierarchy in this society, and it quite literally manifests into the magic system. The higher up you are on this hierarchy, the more access to something called will you're able to harness, which is kind of like the magic in this world, but will is literally manifested from other people living within this society. It's very clearly screwed up. And Viz, as our main character, is a prince from a land that has been taken over by this empire, and he has no desire to give his will over to this empire. So he's kind of been in hiding for a large part of his life. And at the beginning of the story, he's basically recruited, kind of against his will, to become a spy for one faction of the government and enter into this military academy and kind of like uncover some dark secrets and ancient technology to report back to this arm of the government. They do not know who he is or what his past is, but obviously Viz cannot really get out of this situation because they're very powerful benefactors. So we watch Viz as he tries to spy on their behalf, also be blackmailed by other people, make friends, survive his classes, and also just like try to fly under the radar and survive. It has such an interesting combination of a lot of different inputs, and it works super well. It's very, very intense. And if you love like competition, school settings, this would be a great book to pick up. The first one was absolutely explosive, and I can't wait to see where the world is going to take us next in book 2, because I can assure you the end was bananas. The next book that made my top 10, I'm still a little surprised to have it here, but I just cannot deny like how much fun I had while reading this book. And that book is Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. This book was the perfect combination of like angsty character connections, a dash of romance with a really compelling and intriguing fantasy world and plotline. It had everything I could possibly want, like romance and also really well-written fantasy, and it was so much fun to read. I flew through this book and it just delighted me every step along the way. Don't get me wrong though, this book has like some very intense character moments that are like emotionally distressing, but the combination of everything just made this book so delicious. But this is a dual perspective story following our two main characters that both live in a city called Castellon. Castellon is kind of like a city-state from a political point of view. They don't really have a large geographical footprint or an army. All of their powers derive from their economic and their trading capabilities. So it creates a really interesting like push and pull, not only internally but externally surrounding this kingdom. In this book, our first main character we follow is named Kel, and he is something called a sword catcher. Taken in as a young orphan by the royal family, he has been trained his whole life to be able to mimic and stand in for the prince, and possibly one day live up to his name as sword catcher by dying for the prince. Kel is really close to the prince. They have a very complicated relationship, but obviously there are some interesting power dynamics to explore within this relationship. The other main character we follow is Lynn, and Lynn is a healer, and she's also from a cultural and religious group that is completely ostracized and othered within not only Castellon, but like in this wide fantasy world. And that is because Lynn and her people are able to access magic magic where no one else in this world is able to. Because of this, they have to live by different laws and also interact within society in a very different way. Lynn and Kel, of course, cross paths in a very unlikely fashion, and things sort of begin to unravel from there. I, again, cannot emphasize enough how much fun I had reading this story. Something I also appreciated that this is dual perspective, and Lynn and Kel very much had their own distinct storylines to follow. They did interact, but I feel like how Cassandra Clare is intertwining their storylines is not in a very expected fashion, and I feel like there's so much opportunity to grow this world and also grow the perspectives we're reading from in later installments. I really enjoyed book one. I loved the world building, I loved the politics, I loved the magic in this world, and I really enjoyed the two main characters we have read from, and I'm just really looking forward to reading more in this world. And Cassandra Clare really took me by surprise with this. I just feel like it had all the elements of her amazing, addicting writing, and then some really compelling adult high fantasy storylines. The next book that made my top 10 quickly became one of my new favorite fantasy reads. It truly was one of the most unique reading experiences I've ever had, and that book is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I loved this standalone fantasy novel so much. I also feel like it's severely underrated, and all I want is for more people to pick this book up. But this is a beautifully crafted, layered storytelling experience that's supposed to mimic the oral tradition of storytelling, and the author does such a fantastic job bringing that to life within this story and tale. The book itself opens with our main character sitting in the kitchen of his grandmother, and she is telling him a story of their ancestral past. And that experience quickly blends with our main character telling these stories to someone else in his life, which then also quickly blends to an experience of our main character visiting this otherworldly theater where he is sitting down in an audience watching the story unfold on stage. It's a very unique and unexpected narrative approach, and the author does such a fantastic job pulling it off. I loved it immensely. Alongside just the creativity and the structure itself, the story is an amazing one to behold and read. In it, we're following two young men as they basically have to take on an unexpected quest, transporting an all-powerful deity across the land of their empire, chased by not only the evil emperor himself, but his evil sons. It's a very intense and truncated quest story, but along the way you fall in love with these young men, their story, their love, and see them overcome so many different trials and tribulations. It's a true epic to behold. And that, again, paired with the experience of being told this story while reading the story, was just truly unmatched. This is by far not only one of the most unique books I've ever read, but just one of the best fantasy books I've ever read, and I'm going to be talking about this book a lot on this channel, and everyone needs to read it. It is so good. Then we have Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson's first secret project release for 2023. This was another book that I feel like really took me by surprise, and obviously I think that's in part of not knowing what this book was going to be about. I had no expectations going into this story, and transparently, I was completely blown away. This book not only captures the intensity of a Cosmere story by Brandon Sanderson, but it was also so whimsical, so magical, and so much fun, and also had fantastic humor. Brandon Sanderson often describes this book as The Princess Bride, but written from Buttercup's point of view, and it just gave me everything I love in tales and stories, and I just was delighted by this book from beginning to end. It was charming. In this book, we're introduced to our main character, Tress, and Tress has lived on an island her entire life, and she's really had no interest leaving her home for any reason. That is until one day her beloved is unexpectedly taken, and it's really up to her to try to save him. So she decides to venture out into the wide world to try to save the love of her life, but also kind of discover herself along the way. This is definitely an adventure tale set primarily kind of on a pirate ship as we're traversing the sea within this very unique place. In Tress's world, the sea is not comprised of water, but instead something called spores, and there are different colored spores that do different things, but they all interact with water and kind of spontaneously do something, and it's often very, very dangerous. So Tress traversing the sea of spores, of course, is going to have various trials and tribulations and things she has to overcome along the way. Tress makes friends, Tress makes enemies, and she also has a rat companion too. It's just so fun, and it's so cute and so whimsical and really matches the classic fairy tale setting and structure, and I was just in love with this book. I loved this book. It's one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson books I've ever read. It's definitely one of my favorite standalone books he's ever written. It was just so wonderful, and yeah, I had to include it in my top 10. Next on my list is A Desolation Called Peace by Arcadia Martin. This book is actually a sequel and a final book to a duology, the first one being A Memory Called Empire, which also made my favorites list when I read it a few years ago, but I have to say the sequel was even better than the first one, but I loved this duology immensely. This is a sci-fi story that truly just blew my mind in so many different facets. The world building, the culture building that the author had in this and also explored through our main character Mahit was just stunning to behold. I loved it immensely. But if you're not familiar with the series, in it we're introduced to our main character Mahit, and Mahit at the beginning of this book is traveling to a faraway empire. She's always sort of loved culturally from a distance, but she's traveling there to act as an ambassador for her small space station, and she's there to protect their interests against this large, very colonial-leaning place. But when she arrives though, she quickly realizes that her predecessor is no longer alive, and she doesn't know if it's murder or not. From there, she's thrown headfirst into a huge conspiracy that is taking place on this empire and on this planet, and Mahit has a very truncated timeline to not only keep herself alive but protect her station and also just try to get to the bottom of what is happening on this place. This book is truly so intense, but it's not intense in like the hand-to-hand combat sort of way, but truly through the power of like the spoken word and diplomacy and politicking and backdoor deals and navigating really complicated conversations. Like every word in this book and series feels like it has significant meaning. Book one was absolutely mind-boggling and I flew through it. The second one was even better, and the intensity really built on itself perfectly. And again, language and communication and culture are such a huge part of this book and what the author is exploring. There's also a fantastic relationship at the heart of this story too, which I really enjoyed as well. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I could not put it down. I was hooked. It is like the perfect sort of combination of political thriller and sci-fi, and it just has so many interesting avenues that it's exploring, and I loved every single second of it. Next up is another series inclusion, which is the back half of the Legends of the First Empire series by Michael J. Sullivan. I read and included the first 3 books in my 2022 favorites, and I finished reading this series in 2023, and it's another series that quickly moved up to one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. There's something just so pastoral and classic about this that somehow almost makes it like cozy to me, even though there's quite literally nothing really cozy about this narrative and story at all. But if you're not familiar, the Legends of the First Empire series is set in a ancient fantasy landscape, and it's definitely supposed to recount and humanize sort of the founding lore of this fantasy world, which we also read in Michael J. Sullivan's other series, which is a really interesting experience because what is happening in these books is epic, and you can kind of see how those epic tales could be and will ultimately be changed through time as sort of a foundation to this world and society, which I think just creates such an interesting layer to the reading experience of the series in general. But again, in it we're introduced to a variety of characters. Most of them are human, and at the beginning of book 1 they're kind of just focused on living and surviving in their small insular community. In this world, humans worship individuals called the Frey as gods, and Frey are basically like almost immortal elves. They have magic, they live for a long time, therefore they're seen as gods. And they also kind of control everything in this world. One day though, everything is sort of turned upside down when a human accidentally kills one of these Frey, resulting in the build of a war and conflict that spans over many, many, many years, which we see over the course of this series. What we also see over the course of this series is the beginning and the building of human civilization. We see inventions, we see the formation of governments, we see the creation of cities, other types of monikers to the growth of human society, and it's a really interesting addition to this fantasy experience too. I loved the characters in this, I loved the concept of this, I loved the writing style. I also really enjoyed the war and combat writing that Michael J. Sullivan had, and I also appreciated that each book felt very connected to each one, but also had a distinct sort of quality to it. Some of them were more quest focused, some of them were more war focused, and I just really liked the variety in the narrative style and structure that the author provided over the course of the series. And I also loved how classic it felt to me along the way. It just really burrowed itself in my heart, and I'm happy to report I really enjoyed the conclusion of this 6-book series, and just that books 4 through 6 were just excellent. The next book that's on my list I feel like almost snuck its way on the list. It's a more recent read, but it's one that really took me by surprise. I say that like it literally didn't win the Hugo Award. So clearly it's a popular and lauded story, but that book is Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie. What the author was able able to accomplish, not only in the plotting of the story, I could not put it down. It was an absolute page turner in combination with her exploration of society, culture, and gender within this sci-fi world and setting, which just honestly so amazing and interesting. I flew through this and was just absolutely captivated page by page by page. But in this story, we're introduced to our main character Breck, and at the beginning of this book, she's on a very remote and icy planet, and she is one step closer to completing her quest. Breck was not always a lone soldier. She was once also something called the Justice of Toron, which is a massive starship which she existed as for thousands of years. As this starship, she also existed as something called Ancillary, which is 20 distinct different bodies, but they're all connected through one consciousness. So Breck, or the Justice of Toron, used to exist through multiple different realities, but something happened which resulted in Breck now being a single individual. In this book, we are jumping forward and back in time, Breck in the present as she's working towards her revenge or her quest, and also Breck in the past when she existed as the Justice of Toron, and as we unpack the mystery of what happened to her and why she is now existing in the present as a singular individual. This book is absolutely unputdownable. First off, just the mystery of Breck and the conspiracy that Breck is involved in is so wild to read, and the reveals and the twists and turns were also so unconventional and shocking. My jaw was hanging open at so many different points while reading this book. But also what's really interesting about this book is what the author does with gender. Breck, as an ancillary, as an AI, as an individual, doesn't really understand the concept of gender, and her culture and her language doesn't distinguish gender at all, which makes for a very interesting reading experience, especially because it sort of toys with our understanding and perspective as gender and makes the reader sort of confront our own biases as we're introduced to various characters along the way, and shows how society and cultures construct gender expectations differently. And that paired with a sort of conspiracy thriller leaning plotline, I was just mesmerized by this book from beginning to end. The first part of just trying to figure out what in the world is going on, finally sort of getting what is going on and needing to figure out what's going to happen next, and then having my mind blown at the end when things are finally revealed to me. It was just such a satisfying reading experience, and I'm definitely going to be checking out books 2 and 3 soon. This author's got some talent. I also have a fantasy book of hers on my shelf, which I have not read, which I need to get to very soon. Alrighty friends, we're officially in the home stretch. I only have 2 more books to talk about, and one of those books is The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan. This is book 2 to the Empire of the Wolf series, a newer fantasy series, and this release actually came out in 2023, and the 3rd and final book is coming out in early 2024, and simply put, I cannot wait. This is by far one of my favorite newer fantasy releases. I love the characters and everything about the conspiracy that's happening within this book. Each book has also gotten better and better. There is no sophomore slump with The Tyranny of Faith. This book was leagues ahead of the first one, which is The Justice of Kings, which I also love so much. I was absolutely captivated by this story, and I loved every plot element that the author included. But to take a step back and tell you what this book is about, this book is set in a fantasy world that is ruled by an empire. And the emperor in this world maintains control and ensures his laws are being followed through individuals called justices. Justices sort of roam the land and act as the judge and executioner of this law. They also have different and varying types of magical abilities. One of the most powerful and able justices in the land is called Sir Conrad von Volt. But this story is not from Sir Conrad's point of view, oh no, but instead from his female apprentice, who's sort of recounting what happened during this very pivotal moment in political history from the future. So she is writing the story in reflection to us, coloring the experience in very interesting of ways, but also we are reading the story from this character's sort of more novice point of view, and it is so good. Book 1 sort of introduces us to an investigation of aristocratic corruption. Book 2 absolutely expands and explodes the political conspiracy at play, just starting to be introduced to us, and it was so fantastic to read. The bureaucratic corruption, trying to navigate who's on whose side, and sort of the balance of powers in front of us through these different characters was just so unputdownable. Watching our characters try to get a handle of what's happening, who they can trust, and what they should do next. I loved it, and I cannot wait for book 3. I hope it's as good as books 1 and 2, but oh my gosh, Tyranny of Faith, by far one of the best newer fantasy books I've read in a while. This was excellent. And the final book that made my favorite books of the year is another final book in a duology actually, and that is He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. This concluding novel within this very beloved fantasy duology absolutely stuck the landing. I sometimes often have struggles with final books in series. But I'm so happy to report that Shelley Parker Chan did not do that at all. They were able to craft such an interesting, complex, heartbreaking final installment in this series, and it was immensely successful. But if you're not familiar, this duology is set in 14th century China, and it follows the rise of a new empire overthrowing the current Mongol rulers. In this story, we're following a variety of characters, all with kind of their own fates and destinies that are intertwined with one another. One of our primary characters we follow is someone named Zhu, and they at a young age take on the identity and name of their brother, enter a monastery to begin education, and then also get involved in rebellion and begin to move up their ranks. We follow other characters that are attached to different powerful political players, or even the Mongol court itself. This book is obviously following a rebellion and a political power play by a variety of characters who are trying to seize power for themselves, but also through this novel, Shelley Parker Chan is exploring the impacts of gender, not only on this time period, but is using it as a mirror to showcase how society's rejection of identity can lead to not only internal self-hatred that can then be reflected back into the world. You follow a variety of characters who subvert gender expectations in a variety of ways, and who are also terribly mistreated by society based on how they represent or reflect back into the world. You also see how these characters use these expectations and twist them to their own means and gains, and both an incredibly painful and harrowing thing to witness, and a lot of terribly desperate things that you're watching characters take on and choose to do. That being said, though, I feel like Shelley Parker Chan explores a lot of these identities with a lot of empathy, but I'm definitely want to say that this book in particular, the first one as well, is very difficult to read for a lot of different reasons, and there's a plethora of trigger warnings. I have to say, I feel like the author really brought together this fantasy world, really explored a lot of poignant topics, wrote this book beautifully. Their writing style is unbelievably stunning. Also created a really compelling and political plotline and had just the right amount of fantasy to include within this book too. I was absolutely captivated in a duology where I knew the ending because it's history, but the journey that the author took us on was just fantastic. Alrighty guys, those are my favorite books of 2023. Please let me know down below some of your favorite books you read this year, as I would love to know. And I'm definitely compiling a list to take to the bookstore so I can pick everything that I don't already own because I love this time of year. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!